This is a Black Dog Woof Woof production. Death comes to us all, Vladimir Putin too. At the very start of this podcast series, I quoted the eminent Ukrainian psychiatrist Semyon Gluzman, who described Putin's motivation to place an absurdly long table between President Macron of France and himself. Semyon said it was the distance between him and his death. There's been a lot of gossip about Putin's health. Gossip, not facts, because all the good reporters in Moscow have left town, or been shot, or poisoned. The Kremlin goes to great lengths to keep everybody in the dark about Vladimir Putin's health. The lack of scrutiny means we have to work hard in a sepulchral gloom to figure out what is going on. There is a long tradition of this, of keeping everybody guessing about how well or how ill is the Tsar, or Lenin, or Stalin, and now Stalin's heir. And that's funny peculiar, because there is serious evidence that Vladimir Putin may have cancer, and he may be dying. We will be talking to an Oxford University professor who, if he was a betting man, would put not a fiver, but 50 quid on Putin having a dangerous cancer. A standard treatment for that cancer is steroids. The high dosage necessary to fight the cancer drives some patients psychotic. You could start a war that way. No one knows for sure what is wrong with Vladimir Putin, but what is certain is that the master of the Kremlin is consumed by a paranoia about his health so extreme that it is absurd. There is no one left in Moscow, and certainly in his inner circle, who dares to say, "Boss, don't do this. It makes you look silly." I discuss the classic example of Putin paranoia with Jessica Berlin, a German foreign policy analyst. You've been to lots of great universities. Explain as best you can what the story is, what we're laughing about.
Oh gosh, well, I never was a medical student, but as a layman, there's a lot of information about a person's health that can be derived from analyzing their poo. And Vladimir is a secretive kind of guy and doesn't want anybody to know what's going on down below. So apparently he has a mobile shit intelligence unit going around with him every time he takes a dump. And he literally has his own secure porta potty.
Say that again.
A secure porta potty. He has his own toilet that he brings with him on international trips, or if it's logistically not possible to use it when he's in a certain place, that basically his security detail is collecting his poop so that no one can take it and analyze it. And you saw this video of him leaving the bathroom from some function, and there's he's escorted by 6 security guys in suits. And one of them, very ominously, is carrying a suitcase when he comes out of the men's room. I love it.
And what's in the suitcase?
Well, perhaps files.
But it looks as though what they've done is there's some kind of makeshift potty. It's a mobile potty, which maybe it's plastic, which they put, and it must be completely sealed, they put in the loo. So when Putin has a crap or does a pee, all of the body fluids hit I'm guessing, this plastic bag. And then the plastic bag, and then you can't flush the toilet. Obviously, there's a smell of the shit is everywhere. It would be obnoxious. And then a guy comes in, wraps up the plastic, puts it in a suitcase, and then is seen, I believe the video is actually shot in France, the Élysée Palace or something like this. And then there's Putin leaves smiling, and then there's this sort of team of 6 or 7 security goons, one of whom is carrying the president of Russia's feces. And Macron talks about humiliating about let's not humiliate Putin. He humiliates himself.
Yeah, he doesn't need help with that. It's so farcical. It's hilarious. But we have to remember, these people are just people. Every crazy dictator, every murderous, evil dictator through history was a dude. We forget that sometimes. And this thing with the poop fixation, I remember when I lived in China, I was reading a lot of Chinese history. Mao Zedong had people whose job it was to stick their fingers up his ass when he was constipated to help him shit. That's a real thing. Like, it's bizarre. It's disgusting. It's hilarious. These guys, they get into power and they've lost the plots, and we let them run countries.
You're listening to Taking on Putin, episode 11, The Kremlin Patient, written and reported by me, John Sweeney. Is Vladimir Putin a well bunny? If you listen to my podcast, Hunting Gulen, you will remember a bloke I met in a pub who doubted Prince Andrew's alibi that he could not have danced sweatily with Virginia Roberts Giuffre because he'd been shot at during the Falklands War. The man in the pub is the Professor of Sweating at Oxford, or to give him his full title, Ashley Grossman, Professor of Neuroendocrinology. He's been studying Vladimir Putin from afar, and he and I have a natter. The first thing is my own personal observation is that when I doorstepped him about the shooting down of MH17 in 2014, right. I met him, and he gave one of his enormous long answers while the Kremlin security goons sort of stared at me in a rather unfriendly way. Anyway, I thought that his skin was weird because of the Botox. I think he'd recently had Botox, and there was still a kind of strange plasticky sheen about it. But his face was lean and thin. He looked like a weasel or a reptile.
Yeah, a weasel, I think, describes him well. Yeah.
Lately, he looks like a hamster, his cheeks stuffed with straw. What does that tell you?
Well, I think it's interesting. He does seem to have changed in appearance over, well, it's difficult to say, over a period of time. But from a man who previously had a rather gaunt face, both I and some of my colleagues independently all thought his face was rounded and filled out. And that's fairly typically seen in patients either taking steroids, as they're commonly called, or specifically has Cushing's syndrome. Cushing's syndrome defines a disorder of excessive corticosteroids, either as part of a disease process or, more commonly, if someone is taking these for some other reason.
What other reason would there be?
There are a number. The most common reason, at least in the UK, is obstructive airways disease, or chronic bronchitis, as it used to be called, rheumatoid arthritis, very severe asthma, a number of connective tissue diseases. These are all relatively uncommon. Probably the most common is either airway disease or rheumatoid arthritis. But it can also be used in some patients with cancer. We use the word common or garden in conversation, using it in two major ways. One is steroids used for disease processes, and that may be prednisone, dexamethasone, hydrocortisone, and that's a particular type of what we call glucocorticoid. The rather more throwaway use is when we use steroids for bodybuilders, and they're usually anabolic steroids based on testosterone. So that's a completely different type of steroid to what we're talking about here.
Right. What do you think, having looked at his cheeks, have you made a guess as to what steroid it conceivably might be? I know you're not his doctor. I know that you're just observing him from afar. Like, of course.
Yeah, so observing him, he looks as though he's on a glucocorticoid, one of the steroids that's used for inflammatory conditions or cancer.
Earlier on Taking on Putin, you heard from Roman Badanin, the investigative reporter for Project website, about Putin's secret love child with a woman called Svetlana Krivonogich. She and her daughter have never commented on the allegations, nor has Putin. Roman's Project has come up with yet more scoops. that a while back Putin fell off his horse and hurt his back badly. The doctors operated. It didn't go well. In November 2012, Projekt reported Putin and Patriarch Kirill, the not that holy boss of the Kremlin-backed Russian Orthodox Church, both laid a wreath in Red Square. The bish made the cut, but Putin was edited out by state TV. The reason, Projekt said, was that Putin limped so badly that they decided to suppress the video. But footage of lame Putin went viral thanks to the website of the Moscow Patriarchate, where the unedited video of the ceremony was posted. That December, Projekt reported for Putin's sake, they even shorted the Bolshoi concert marking the 200th anniversary of the victory over Napoleon to an hour. But in the end, Putin didn't make it. That same month, when the Japanese Prime Minister came to the Kremlin, Putin did not show up. The word was, the chief is not well, needed surgery, and he was wearing a corset, like he do. The Kremlin Live Factory then came up with what Projekt calls canned footage, undated, pre-recorded video meetings showing Putin meeting patsies when, in reality, he was flat on his back in agony. So, just like Humpty Dumpty, all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Did the fall from the horse lead to steroid abuse? Here's the prof.
Possible, but rather unlikely. If you fall off a horse and you fracture a vertebrae, then it can be excruciatingly painful. You might temporarily use some steroids to combat the inflammation and local inflammation. But they're not very effective as simple painkillers. You probably only take them for a short time. And in fact, if anything, long-term taking steroids would exacerbate the thinning of your bones and make it more likely that you'd fracture in the future. So having some sort of traumatic fracture many years ago wouldn't account for the fact that he looks to be taking high-dose corticosteroids right now.
So then we're down to the cancers. So the first time I hear this is a story from somebody in Kyiv who is connected to or working for Ukrainian military intelligence. I can't explain exactly why, but I'm very sure that that's the case. She told me that she knew an oligarch in Moscow who was close to Putin, who said he's got cancer of the liver. And that's why he's got these bloated cheeks that we're talking about, the hamster effect, because he's on steroids to counter the cancer. Separately, my friend Michael Weiss, who is writing a book about Russian military intelligence, the GRU, and is well plugged into the wider US intelligence community, heard that it was cancer of the blood. A third version, which has popped up on Russian social media, is cancer of the abdomen. A fourth is thyroid cancer. And a fifth is cancer of the lymphatic glands. Right.
Shall I sort of work through those?
Yes. You're
Fine.
the prof.
Okay. So let's start towards the end, thyroid cancer. Now, thyroid cancer is relatively uncommon. It tends to occur in younger women rather than men, but when it does occur in men, it tends to be quite severe. But it's usually readily treatable. It's the long-term mortality is relatively low if treated well, and in general doesn't tend to involve steroid treatment of any sort. So although he may be at risk or have had thyroid cancer at some point or another, the link with steroids makes that a little bit unlikely. So moving on, he's got cancer of the liver. That's also a little bit complicated because there are primary cancers of the liver, so hepatocellular carcinoma. They tend to occur in people with usually some sort of a viral illness in the past, but they're also relatively rare. So the much more common reason for having cancer in the liver are secondaries, which means that the cancer is somewhere else and they've simply spread there. And that's quite common with quite a lot of cancers. And that would also fit in with something wrong in his abdomen, because the liver is in the abdomen. What's also in the abdomen are a lot of lymph nodes. So tying that together and then thinking about blood cancer. Now, there are three major types of blood cancer. Leukemia, which many people have heard of the white blood cells. Myeloma, which also the disease tend to be a much later life of a particular type of immune cell, the plasma cell. And the third type, lymphoma, which is usually, although it's called a blood cancer, it's in the lymph glands. And that would fit in much better with this idea of lymphadenopathy or abnormal lymph glands. And it would also fit in much better because these are very sensitive to steroid treatment. So if you put those facts together, appearing to be on high-dose steroids, being told there's problems in his abdomen, the lymphadenopathy, and a query blood cancer, the most likely way of putting everything in one basket, as it were, is to say he's got a lymphoma, and the lymphoma is being treated with steroids as well, possibly as other drugs.
Lymphoma being
lymphoma, sorry, that oma generally means a tumor. So lymphoma means a cancer of the lymph glands, of the cells in the lymph glands.
And just remind everybody, what are the lymphs? It's the other. It's the other system which isn't the blood.
Exactly right. The lymph vessels drain a lot of the fluid from the blood and take it back into the bloodstream. But running through these and going into the lymph nodes are lymphocytes. And these are the major sort of fighters, the soldiers, the immune cells of the body fighting off infection. And they go round and round, sampling everywhere to see if you've got anything wrong and killing off bugs.
So if you were a betting man, you'd put a fiver on him having cancer of the lymphatic system?
I'd probably put £50 on cancer of the lymphatic system based on what we know at the moment, depending on the odds.
You're the man, Ash, you're the man. So what's the steroid treatment? What's it do to you? What's it do to your mood?
Well, that's a very important point, because these steroids have manifold effects on the body. And what we try and do and have done is to separate the good bits from the bad bits. But so far, by and large, they all go together. So while they can dampen down the immune system, which in terms of fighting a lymphoma is good because it kills the lymphocytes, it will also cause lots of changes in protein in the body. So your muscles get thinner, your skin gets thinner, you're more likely to form blood clots, you're more likely to become diabetic, and the fat moves into the central part of your tummy, the abdomen. So there are all these huge changes. But most importantly, I think from the current point of view, is that the steroid receptors, the things that respond to steroids, are very highly concentrated in the brain. So patients who are on high doses of steroids often have mental problems of one type or another. It may be anxiety, it may be depression. Some manage to escape them altogether. In other cases, they may become, frankly, psychotic. Mad.
Aggressive. Very aggressive.
It could be. I had to sort of reassure people out there who are on steroids that by and large doctors keep a note of that, make sure they're not on too much. But a known side effect is to cause mental changes. I've seen patients become manic, some become highly depressed, irritable, irascible, difficult to deal with.
And the simple medicine of it is that because you're fighting a cancer, objectively, it's better to for a patient to endure these some of these side effects for the greater good of the battle against the cancer. That's your the medical calculation.
That's the general calculation.
The problem here is the Kremlin patient has control of the world's biggest stockpile of nuclear weapons.
that is indeed true. And it's also a matter that when you see a patient who's having severe steroidal side effects, there's usually someone else, a carer, a partner, a close associate, with whom one can negotiate and discuss the situation and try and lower the dose. If the patient is the most powerful person in the room, then it's maybe quite difficult to negotiate that, because by its very nature, the steroids will have affected their cognitive and emotional processes.
Ashley Grossman suspects that this isn't the first nuclear Armageddon crisis caused by steroids.
When John F. Kennedy was young, he was in London and he developed a disease called Addison's disease. Now, Addison's means it's the opposite. The adrenals stop working, they fail. But it was only in the very early 1950s that the replacement treatment, which is steroids, became available. And as I understand it, my late mother's GP was in North London and was asked to see the future President Kennedy, John Kennedy. And at the time, the very early steroids were about being produced for patient treatment. So the evidence does suggest, and I think that was admitted later on, he had Addison's disease. He was on steroids as replacement, i.e. to give him a normal level. And we have many patients who do very well on that. But at that time, it would have been quite hard to gauge what level of hormone to give him. And if you do look at the pictures at that time, you do see from time to time, he did change and also develop this round, puffy face, which almost certainly indicated he was being rather overtreated, in a sense, in error, because it was very difficult to titrate the dose at that time. So he was being treated as a replacement, not as a pharmacological treatment, but the dose did seem to vary, and you can see it in varying photographs from that time in the late 50s, early 60s.
You can actually draw a line, because the last time the world seemed to be in a very, very scary place was 1963 with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
You can indeed.
And you could say that was possibly steroid abuse in relation to JFK's aggressive move against...
It has been suggested that the poor dose control of what were available at the time, and remember, this is a very early days. Previously, patients with Addison's disease died in fairly short measure. That would have caused changes in his mentation, in his mental state, in his irritability, possibly his aggressiveness, as well as any other possible so-called recreational drugs he was apparently using at that time. But the combination of the two would certainly have caused a problem. So if one was to go right out on a limb, I'm not putting 50 pounds on this, you could say that the two major world crises, and the Cuban Missile Crisis and currently relating to nuclear weapons, may have a steroid tinge to them.
Is history repeating itself?
As they say, history repeats itself. The first time in tragedy, and the second time in farce. I would hope not, but there may be an element of it.
We don't know. Another way of putting it is that history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes.
I think that's a nice way of putting it. Better than mine.
So you'd put 50, you might, if you were a betting man, put 50 quid on Putin having lymphatic cancer, being treated with steroids. Would you like to be his doctor?
I think that's an unfair question, but no, I would not. I would not like to be his doctor for a number of reasons. One of them being, if things weren't going too well, I'm not sure what effect that would have on me. But more significantly, the other drugs I might want to use for the treatment of a lymphoma, lymphatic cancer, may not necessarily be available. And one doesn't know how effective Russian treatments, medicine are at present. And we do know that they rely on for a lot of their drugs on the West. And even in the Kremlin, they may not be available. So I think one would be in a particularly difficult situation to be his personal physician right now.
Professor Grossman has written close to 1,000 medical papers. He really does know his stuff. That he, if he were a betting man, would put 50 quid on Putin suffering from a life-threatening lymphatic cancer is extraordinary. So too is his observation that if Putin has overdosed on steroids, that might make him psychotic. Vera Tolz is a Russian-born academic who was kicked out of the Soviet Union in 1982 because of her dissident work. She's now a professor of Russian politics at Manchester University. She told me that Putin seemed to be following the disinformation playbook to hide the state of his health from Russians and the rest of the world. I asked her, is it possible that Putin has a body double?
I'm fairly sure that there is some doppelganger. One of the reasons could be not his health. One of the reasons is that he is completely paranoid. And I think there is a reliable American intelligence that most of his time he spends in this bunker in the Urals. So when Putin needs to be shown in a crowd of people, in Moscow, there might be indeed kind of somebody impersonating him, but the reason might be paranoia and fear of being killed rather than that he is physically incapable.
Yes. So it struck me that it was very interesting that when he saw Macron, and you wouldn't send a doppelganger to talk to Macron, he was really 30 feet.
Yes,
long table.
Yeah.
And then there was footage of him hobnobbing with elderly kind of generals and stuff, I think on the 9th of May, where he was really quite close. So there was an anomaly there, i.e. with Macron, he's 30 feet away, and then suddenly he's kind of pressing the flesh, albeit of the kind of behatted military hoi polloi, but nevertheless mixing with them pretty closely, nothing like Macron. Mm-hmm. And I thought, is that him or is that a double?
Or is it something which is recorded some time ago? Because there were reports, he met in March, I think it's on the 8th of March, the International Women's Day. He allegedly met with female representatives of Aeroflot, the Russian main airline. And then there were all these reports on oppositional channels that, in fact, this meeting was not from 2022, but a few years ago. So that could be the case as well.
Once again, we don't know what is the true story about Vladimir Putin's health because all the good reporters have left Dodge. But we know this, that the Kremlin most likely uses a double, and its patsy media puts out canned footage that points to something seriously wrong. Here's Taras Kuzio, Yorkshire-born but now professor of political science at Kyiv University. So, Vladimir Putin, why did he invade the big full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022? Why? Why do that?
There are really three probably factors in this as to trying to explain why now. And the first one I would say is that Putin doesn't think he has much time left on Earth. Now, we don't know what he's got. There are various rumors, etc. There's some decent investigations, but it doesn't really matter to some degree. If he's got it into his head, he hasn't got much time left. Then what that means, what that translates into, I've got to get my goal done. And he's had a goal for the last 10 years of entering Russian history textbooks as the gatherer of Russian lands.
Once again, we don't know for sure how unwell Putin is. But nonetheless, the evidence of old footage being used and the serious possibility that there is a body double points to the invasion being Putin's last throw of the dice. There is no coming back from February the 24th. George Orwell, sometimes I feel his hand on my shoulder as I write this podcast, once wrote, "All propaganda is lies, even when one is telling the truth. Putin's propaganda, the photos of him topless on horseback diving for ancient treasure, swimming the butterfly in a freezing lake, are both true and lies, all at the same time. But that imagery has fallen apart these days. He's alone at the end of a long table, sitting with a rug over his knees, his fist clenching the side of a table. He looks fragile, feeble, an old man whose spark is dying. The reason he's invaded, the full-scale invasion, is because TikTok goes the clock and he's running out of time.
Those days are gone. So macho Putin's gone. He looks very different. He looks weaker. He doesn't look like the kind of the guy who's strutting around in gym clothes and without a shirt on all the time.
Does he? How's he when he's talking? Because he used to talk very, very forcefully and clearly. I mean, he trained as a lawyer. He did his thesis, if he wrote it, on kind of international law and all that kind of malarkey. How's he talk now?
I think he's an angrier guy. He was always angry, but he seems to come across both when he's talking to his own security.
People like Narushkin,
yes.
the national security chief.
Yes, he's more angrier. And when he does his speeches, he's angrier. I mean, that, I think, again, has to be a reflection of his state of mind arising from his health. He's always been an angry person because he's always I don't think he's ever gotten over the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he always, of course, because of his KGB mindset, that means conspiracies everywhere. And there were conspiracies behind the collapse of the Soviet Union, conspiracies behind the color revolutions, and then conspiracies making Ukraine into this so-called anti-Russian project. I mean, so because on the Russian TV for the last 15 years, on a daily basis, Ukraine has been portrayed as a US puppet state, and that this isn't a real country. The little Russians want to join, little Russians being the Russian understanding of how Ukrainians should be. Little Russians want to join Mother Russia, but they're prevented from doing so by the CIA and these horrible nationalists.
Vladimir Putin was once just a Russian nationalist. But over the last few years, he's moved further and further to the right. His John the Baptist figure, if you like, is Alexander Dugin. With his long hair and grey-white beard, he looks like a defrocked Orthodox priest. In Moscow, he's called Putin's Rasputin, or Putin's brain. His shtick is Eurasianism, that Russia stands outside and against the Western tradition of liberal democracy. He is the high priest of the new Russian fascism. I met him in Moscow in 2016 while making a BBC Panorama, Trump, the Kremlin candidate, ? Here's a clip from the show. It's fair to say that Dugin and I did not hit it off. People ask questions about Vladimir Putin's commitment to democracy.
But please be careful. And you could not teach us democracy because you're trying to impose to every people, every state, American system of values without asking. And it is absolutely racist. You are racist.
But what happens is, if you're critical of Vladimir Putin, you may end up dead.
For example, if you are engaged in WikiLeaks, you can be murdered.
Julian Assange is dead, is he?
Not, but the people...
So hold on a second. Please, tell me about Boris Nemtsov. He was murdered 100 yards from...
By Putin? You think he was murdered by Putin?
So he was critical of Putin. Can you tell me, can you list the number of American journalists who have died under Obama?
It is completely stupid kind of conversation.
Okay, very good.
Please, I'm very nice to meet you, but I don't like to continue.
And he got up and left. But after that, by the way, after that interview, I was followed in Russia everywhere I went. Mm-hmm. So it was a simple message. If you have an argument with Alexander Dugin, then the Russian secret state will make your life very unpleasant.
The people like Dugin were behind the very well-known 1993 attempted coup in Russia that Yeltsin put down when he fired used tanks to destroy the Russian parliament. These crazies, and they were called like a red-brown coalition, so fascists and communists in a coalition, went to the margins of politics under Yeltsin. Under Putin from 2000, they gradually moved from the margins to the center. And today, Putin is basically the contemporary Dugin. Why do I mean that? In 2014, Alexander Dugin was some reason, he was a professor at a Moscow university. And he went on YouTube and said, Ukrainians should be killed, killed, and killed. Because of that very fascist, racist statement, he was kicked out of the university. Today, Putin is doing the same. So in those intervening 8 years, what's happened is that Putin's become the Dugin. Putin's been reading all this stuff.
If Putin has cancer, then he is worried sick, but he is immune compromised and fears human contact. Picture Putin alone in his bunker at the far end of a long decontamination tunnel, cut off, his world illuminated solely by the fascist twilight.
And during the COVID isolation pandemic, he's been on his own, he's read too many books, all of these kind of Eurasianist, fascist, white Russian, emigre literature. And he's basically implementing today what he didn't do in 2000, because there is a question, why did he not do the invasion in 2014? Why now? I think it's Putin's evolved. He's gone even further to the right. He's gone from a Russian nationalist to a fascist. And he's basically adopted the programs of these crazies, these extremist fascists like Dugin, that were saying this stuff in 2014, but Putin was saying, oh. But now he's implementing. Now it's Putin going, kill Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians are very simple.
But the Kremlin's battle plan, let's walk into Kyiv, did not pan out that way. Here's Vera Tolz.
And we see, obviously, now with this war, it clearly is not going according to plan. And Putin expected the replay of the Crimea. And the fact that it wouldn't be a replay of the Crimea was obvious, I think, to anyone kind of studies the region.
The war did not come out of nowhere. The tragedy of the full-scale invasion was preceded by 2 decades more of Putin destroying the checks and balances of the Russian state by the murder and silencing of opposition figures we've talked about earlier in this series, by the ocean of disinformation which the master of the Kremlin appears to swim in himself. Vera Tolz was so hated by the Soviet system, they expelled her from the country. Mad as this seems, she believes that the old Soviet Union was a better, more rational place than Putin's Russia.
He's a hostage of his own disinformation, because his subordinates told him what he wanted to hear. But also, I think the fact that he wasn't promoted in the KGB in the Soviet period and then became the leader of the country in the post-Soviet period, actually highlights the difference between the Soviet system and the system which Putin created in the 2000s in favor, it's a former dissident expelled from the Soviet Union speaking, and somebody who grew up in the family which hated the Soviet regime. It was a more rationally functioning system, and actually a system which was less dangerous to the world than Putin's, because in the Soviet system, there were formal structures where people and those in charge, they had to be accountable to some extent. Whereas in contemporary Russia, it's an extremely personalized dictatorship with absolutely no formal institutions and no accountability whatsoever.
By the way, I go into all of this at greater length in my book, Killer in the Kremlin, published by Transworld in July 2022. I get to read the audiobook too. For now, Vladimir Putin is still very much alive. In the meantime, there's the full-scale war in Ukraine going on right now. The government in Kyiv is saying 100 of its soldiers are dying a day. These are 3 Ukrainian priests singing at the funeral of Roman Ratushny. He was a Ukrainian fighter. He died fighting the Russians, and he's 24 years old. The cost of Vladimir Putin's war is being paid in blood, and that cost is rising by the day. Next up is the final episode in this series, taking on Putin at the sharp end. I hope to go towards the war to see how the Ukrainian army is defending against the Russian invasion. Don't worry, I'll be wearing my lucky orange hat, so listen out for that. You've been listening to Taking on Putin, the Kremlin Patient. Thanks to BBC Panorama for the clip from Trump, the Kremlin candidate. Taking on Putin is a podcast series written and reported by me, John Sweeney, for Black Dog Woof Woof Productions, produced in Kyiv and London. In Kyiv, the recording is done by Syndicate Productions. In London, production is by Chalk and Blade. The executive producer is Laura Sheeter, with other production by the team. It's mixed and sound designed by Alex Paul Felix, with original music by Thomas Hewitt-Jones. I've launched a crowdfunder to help fund this podcast, Taking on Putin. There are lots of costs. Lawyers checking things out, making sure that it gets to all the right platforms, making sure that the people that I'm working with, and I, are safe from legal and other threats. I'm not going to spell them out, but use your imagination. So, if you can help me tell this story, please help me crowdfund it. In your search engine, dial in Crowdfunder Taking on Putin with me, John Sweeney. Thank you for listening, and thank you for coming along for the ride. The Kremlin won't like it. Take care, and love from Kyiv.